All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Kristy Knichel, co-host of the LLC podcast. It's an honor to introduce listeners to inspiring women who are making real difference in logistics and supply chain. With the LLC podcast, you'll hear inspirational stories, both personal and professional challenges our guests have overcome, how their backgrounds help to shape who they are today, and how they empower others to give back to their communities and often the world. So joining me today, I'm super excited to introduce Sarah Riggs Amico. She is the chairman and CEO of Jack Cooper, a certified woman-owned business enterprise and one of North America's largest finished vehicle logistics companies. Sarah is passionate about democracy and the opportunity for everyone in our nation to share in the American dream. She has become a familiar face across the national media landscape discussing politics, economic justice, and supply chain issues. Sarah has appeared on MSNBC, Fox News, SiriusXM, NPR, the Michael Steele podcast, Cheddar, The Hill TV, Political Rewind on Georgia Public Broadcasting, Pantsuit Politics, The Laura Coates Show, The Rick Smith Show. Her efforts to save and create union jobs and to frame public policy from a business perspective have been covered in the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, the Atlantic Journal-Constitution, Politico, the American Prospect, and more. She is an avid reader, loves the beach, and spends her free time watching or driving to her kids' sporting events, studying languages, 5 so far, and learning how to quilt with her grandmother. Sarah and her husband Andrea live in Marietta, Georgia, with their 2 daughters and cat Jack and their dog Stella. Thank you so much for being a part of our show today.
Thank you very much for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, I'm even more excited because after reading that, how impressive of a story is that?
Oh, that's very kind. Look, I've had I feel like it's a little bit of a Walter Mitty life. And it makes things interesting, right? In the supply chain for the last few years, as you know, one thing we have not been missing is interesting turns of events. So I feel like it's been a well-made match, especially over the last few years as we navigate a lot of these really profound changes in the supply chain and logistics universe.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, why don't we start first with you telling everyone a little bit about yourself, your background, what have you done and how did you get into logistics? And sometimes I like to say, why are you still in logistics? I think you have a lot to share, so let's start with that.
Yeah, sure. And there's probably a lot of us in the trucking side of the logistics industry that come from multi-generational families, and that's certainly the case for me as well. My granddad, my mother's father, and my uncle had a small owner-operator trucking business. It, like many independently owned trucking fleets, did not survive, but on that side of the family, I guess you could call me like third generation in trucking. My first interaction with trucking was when I was about 6 years old. My dad ran a company for a really wealthy family that bought a business that made sleeper cabs for Class 8 trucks. So I remember walking the factory floor, looking at the fiberglass molds. We had a mailbox that was made in the shape of a pickup, a heavy truck cab. So definitely in the blood from that side. But the specific piece of the logistics industry that I work in is finished vehicle logistics. So we do a lot of car hauling or auto hauling, truck away, depending on who you are or in what part of the country. You call it one of those 3 things, but transporting finished vehicles largely from assembly plants, but certainly also from ports, railheads, vehicle distribution centers, and increasingly in the era of batch and hold, from offsite lots back to the dealerships or points of sale or to other nodes in the chain. And on that side, my family on my dad's side actually has a lot of auto industry experience as well. My granddad on his side worked as a custodial worker in a GM factory in St. Louis. My dad worked through his way through college at a school called General Motors Institute. Actually, Mary Barra, the CEO and chairman at GM, also is a GMI alumna. And that's how he paid his way through college. He would work for 6 weeks in a GM factory, and then he would go to college for 6 weeks. So in a lot of ways, and they also paid for his graduate school. So in a lot of ways, I feel like both on the car and on the trucking side, this was kind of in the blood. Having said that, like most adolescents, I think I thought I would run in the absolute opposite direction. So when I went to college, I studied politics, not political science, but politics. So sort of the functioning of governments and elections. Spent 3 semesters overseas studying comparative politics. The devolution of Scottish Parliament in the UK was a personal favorite. There's nothing like going to study, at the exact moment that devolution happens when you're a politics major. My senior thesis in college was actually during the 2000 election. I don't think we called it a thesis. It was like the election 2000 paper or whatever. But it was kind of funny at the time. It felt like such an anomaly because we got to the point in December where our papers were due. And of course, there was no presidential election outcome yet because it ended up in the Supreme Court in the universe of hanging chads. Funny how 25 years later, that actually seems more expected than not in our elections to a certain extent. So studied politics, went to business school, graduated in 2003 from Harvard. Absolutely loved the experience. About 37% of my class was international, and our very first week of school was September 11th. So it was sort of just this class of people in my cohort at business school that were very much forged in the fires of what an increasingly globalized world looked like, and some of the changing dangers that Western democracies and honestly people all over the world were going to face in that environment. So my first love professionally was probably politics. But I didn't really want to work on the Hill. I had spent a summer working in the U.S. House at the Committee on Small Business with a congressman and later senator from Missouri, actually a Republican, which folks who know my politics will probably giggle about, but a gentleman named Jim Talent, who was actually a really good human being. And we worked on women's business center legislation. So after the summer on the Hill, it turned out I was a lot more passionate about the Women's Business Center part of that than I was about the politics. And, this was back in the late 90s. Intern in Washington was still kind of a tainted term post-Lewinsky scandal. And my observations about Congress back then were pretty shocking to a young, very idealistic woman who had, I took the AP government, I was on the Constitution and debate teams in high school. I really loved political theory. And when I got to Congress and I saw that oftentimes the people who were the best listeners, the most collaborative, the most earnest, the people who listened to their constituents above everything else, they were more often than not sort of the perennial losers in the political arena. It was kind of a shock. And so I, did what I thought everybody did when they didn't know what they want to be when they grow up anymore. And I moved to Paris and studied there for a while. And as I was on my way back to the United States, I spent a summer working for a Fortune 500 company in the UK. And I think it was sort of just this light bulb moment for me where in the business world, the harder you worked, the luckier you got. And the more collaborative and empathetic you were with the teams, the better solutions you could come up with. And in the end, there was a scoreboard that wasn't just votes of people's opinions, but dollars and cents on the board. It was a moment of, that's my lane. I want to go to business school. So came back to the States, finished college, and really went to business school immediately after, which was pretty unusual at the time. I think the average age in my class at Harvard Business School was about 27, maybe 28. And I was 21 when I got in. So it was like out of the frying pan into the fire. And from there, I spent, the obligatory couple of years after school in consulting, software consulting. I'd worked largely for pharmaceutical strategic planning organizations within big pharma. And it turned out I didn't have a lot of love for big pharma or software consulting, but I did love strategic planning. So I spent about 10 years in media, largely doing that, working sometime in a venture capital seed fund with the William Morris Agency, Venrock, Excel Partners, and AT&T, which was a lot of fun. I got to see literally hundreds of media startup plans. And then, I guess it was after I had my first daughter. I had spent about a decade in media, was a department head in a big talent agency at age 29, which, there aren't that many women leading departments out there, but there certainly aren't at that age, or at least there weren't at the time, right? Like this is 15, 20 years ago at this point. And then the world changed. I became a mom, and my family, this was around the time of the 2008 economic collapse, 2008, 2009. My dad had bought a little business in 2008 with about 100 employees that did vehicle logistics. And I had been talking to him almost, once or twice a day, just kind of brainstorming and thinking about the different approaches they could take as the economy was really being upended all around them. And by 2011, when we had our daughter, it just felt like my heart was really back in the place where I grew up, which was supply chain and logistics and the trucking side of things. And so it was a really sort of meandering road to come home, I think is how I would call it. But I wouldn't trade it for anything. I mean, I've had the chance to live sort of in both coasts, New York and LA, to live overseas, to be dropped into a country where I thought I had command of the language, only to learn how woefully inadequate that command was, and sort of have to learn on the fly or get comfortable being silent, which, as you can tell, I wouldn't be. And I've also had the chance to grow up in the heartland, and now with my family live in, sort of the new American South, right? As Atlanta and Georgia have become economic powerhouses really in this country, and in the industrials and logistics space as well. So I think every piece of that experience along the way has informed the way that I manage the business, the way that I think about building and leading a team, and probably also the way I think about strategy still, right? The one part of that first job out of business school that really stuck with me was strategic planning and thinking about what does the world look like, 10 moves or 10 years down the chessboard. And I think in the supply chain environment where we are today, that's really the place where winners and losers in our industry, or innovators versus those who fall behind, that's the line that will divide those groups.
Wow, such an incredible journey you've had throughout your life. And I'm just so impressed. And I think definitely what you said in regards to all the different experiences you had really brought you for full circle to where you're at today. One of the first things I want to talk to you about a little bit that's intriguing to me, because obviously, I know this week obviously was the presidential election, and you did run for Senate. And if you could talk a little bit just about that, and what were you looking to accomplish if you were to make it into the Senate, and what is important to you about that?
Yeah, so it's a good question. I first ran for office actually in 2018. I was the Democratic nominee for Lieutenant Governor of Georgia. And to me, it was about this moment where I really did feel like democracy as we understood it, in the American electorate as we understood it, was really in a state of upheaval. You'll notice that's a theme. I seem to be drawn to places where there's a lot of churn, a lot of change, a lot of dynamic environment, but also ergo a lot of opportunity to make really positive contributions. And I certainly had not envisioned having a 3 and a 5-year-old and running for statewide office in the largest landmass state east of the Mississippi, which Georgia is. But I felt really called to do it. As a business person, we were increasingly spending time in the boardroom talking about affordability and accessibility of healthcare for our employees, right? And how that varied state to state. We were spending a lot of time talking about whether or not the pensions of our employees were going to be preserved, because at the time they were all sort of underfunded and failing, not because of anything the union workers had done wrong, and not because of anything the businesses had done wrong, but because those funds, years before I was even born, had been mismanaged. And so I felt like it wasn't necessarily that I went out looking for a political opportunity. In fact, probably all things considered, I wouldn't have done that with kids that young, although they had a lot of fun traveling the state with us. I think it came to me where there was a point where business people have to understand that we don't operate independent of the political context in which we operate. We're very much intertwined with that environment. So, I had a wonderful experience, went through 150 counties in 10 months in Georgia. That is the most soul restoring, probably refreshing, hopeful thing I've ever done outside of having kids, because you meet so many people from so many walks of life, and you realize people kind of by and large want the same things, right? They want more opportunity for their kids than they want anything else for themselves. And so I think for me, that was really formative. But ultimately, I ran with a woman who was running for governor, although we had independent elections, named Stacey Abrams. She became, a juggernaut. I had a great time, but we didn't win. And in 2020, as the economy, even before the pandemic, but the economy in my part of the supply chain, so the auto supply chain, you'll remember we had a strike that year. We had taken our company through a very painful restructuring, in part due to these underfunded pensions and the threat that they pose not only to our workers, but to the continued operation of our business. And I felt really strongly that nobody was talking about what we could do to rescue and secure the economic futures of American workers. And so that's why I ran for Senate in 2020. Got my butt kicked in the primary. Probably not a great idea to take your company through a bankruptcy restructuring at the same time that you're launching a campaign for U.S. Senate. However, even if you're doing that to save 2,000 jobs, which we very successfully did without anyone losing their health care, their union seniority, or their job, I do think it was a really good lesson for me. You don't always have to win the election to win the argument. And, the ability to drive the conversation in 2019 when the primary started through to 2020, June of 2020 was our primary. And so, of course, by that time, the pandemic had started. And all of a sudden, economic security and economic justice for folks was really front and center because we were all living in the most uncertain economic times in our lives. And of course, 2 years later, the American Rescue Plan was passed that actually rescued the pensions, the very same pensions that I was talking about. So I feel like even though in the end it didn't work out, and maybe gravity is that I'm really meant to stay in business, I feel very proud of the contributions that I was able to bring from my experience as a logistics executive, as a woman running a unionized company who's proud to create the kind of jobs and security that most politicians only talk about, but they've never actually created. I felt really proud of the contribution to that discussion that we made. And so I'm in the strange camp of didn't win, but have absolutely no regrets.
Yeah, no, that's awesome because you still were able to accomplish it without getting into that seat, so to speak, because you were heard. And it helped with the whole situation because, as you mentioned, your company does have a lot of union workers, right? How many union workers do you have?
So we're at about 1,200 on the driver side, and it vacillates, right? Because in finished vehicle logistics, your workforce expands and contracts with volumes. But I would say around, anywhere between 900 and 1,400, depending on the season. And that includes some union mechanics as well.
Yeah, no, that's so awesome and just so inspiring to hear. And do you, I know you're probably still involved maybe in politics a little bit, and do you feel like, especially being in logistics in particular, do you go to Congress? I know I go to Congress with the TIA every year to advocate for supply chain legislation that we need to get, or things that aren't being paid attention to. Is that something you're still doing and feel like you're making some groundwork there?
Yes, ma'am. I think our industry needs it, right? And especially on the trucking side, because the railroads, they have this breathtaking, vast, deep network on the government affairs side, right? They have very integrated ways to communicate with members of Congress. in vehicle logistics, it's really such a small but important niche in the supply chain. So if you think about it, 100% of the cars in this country that anyone drives, so anyone listening to your show, 100% of your cars were delivered on a truck. It just is what it is, at least on the last mile. Probably 80% of the total miles that vehicles travel through the supply chain go on the rails. And about 15 to 20% go on trucks, but 100% of the last miles go on the truck. And so we're this sort of a small but mighty piece of this supply chain. And if you think about it, we sit at this intersection of where everything can go sideways: railheads, ports, manufacturing, driver shortages. So, and during the pandemic, of course, the semiconductor chip shortage. So we're this interesting little microcosm of we're at the center of the perfect storm when something goes wrong. And we're also at the end of the chain, which, as everybody else in logistics listening to this will know, you're sort of expected to play cleanup for anything that went wrong upstream, right? And like get it back on track. And so I think we spend time where we can. Lobbying is, I guess, a word for it, but more often than not, educating folks about this really critical piece of the supply chain, because we punch way above our weight when it comes to consumer prices and inflation, right? Car prices were driving something like 30% of inflation at the peak. And that's because it's the largest asset most families own outside of their home. And the average cost of a car has gone up. Cost of financing that has gone up. This is a really important piece of economic security for Americans, and we're critical to getting that in their hands at an affordable price. And so we spend our time really focused on a couple of areas. Number one is infrastructure advocacy, right? I love that we finally, under President Biden, but with bipartisan support, and gosh, I love that word because you don't see a lot of it, but bipartisan infrastructure bill to really make sure that the roadways and infrastructure, bridges and tunnels that our drivers are using are safe, not just for our drivers, but for everyone who shares the road. Making sure that infrastructure is competitive to get products to market in the most efficient and safe manner possible so that American companies and manufacturers can remain competitive. And also we look at sort of what does that look like, again, in that strategic planning timeline, 10 or 20 years down the road. What does the infrastructure of the future need to look like? What is transportation in the future? How do we get clean energy or net zero emissions in the part of our economy, heavy trucking, which could be one of the hardest to sort of stamp out carbon pollution? So, for example, electric trucks or renewable natural gas, LNG, RNG, CNG truck, like whatever is cleaner technology, a lot of times that's actually a heavier power unit in a truck than a traditional diesel engine would be. And in trucking, as most of your audience will know, your capacity is sort of maxed out by weight and length in the class of vehicle that you're in, right? Whether you're in an intermodal container or you're in a class 6, 7, 8 truck, you have very finite constraints on how much you can move, independent of what the price of that freight is doing. So when you eat up, our weight limit is 80,000 pounds, which is about as low as it gets in trucking for any type of freight. To put it in perspective, a fully loaded intermodal container leaving a port down in Savannah, the other end of my state, might leave at 100,000 pounds. So we're at 80,000 pounds. If you have a 5,000 or 6,000 pound increase in the weight of the cab to get an electric truck, even if you have all the charging infrastructure in the world, even if you can finance it or make it affordable, and right now they're much more expensive than diesel, you're talking about giving up 6% of your capacity. And you're trying to figure out how to do that without cheating your workers and without driving up consumer prices. So I think at some point, the federal government, if they really want to transition to cleaner energy, will have to look at weight variances, just like they've done for natural gas powered vehicles, which is, I think, about a 2,000 pound weight limit variance. So those are the areas where we spend the most time in Congress.
Yeah, no, I mean, I appreciate you sharing that, because obviously that has been a big topic in, I mean, not just in logistics, but in the government in particular, in regards to those type of, new trucks and stuff coming out. Does your fleet have any of those trucks at this time, or is that something you guys are thinking about as well?
You froze up for just a second. Can you repeat the question?
Yes, absolutely. So does your company have any of those trucks now in your fleet,
We
or?
do. We do. We have pilot programs for electric trucks. We are always actively looking for renewable natural gas. Renewable natural gas, for folks that might be listening that don't know, think of this as like from an environmental standpoint, getting like double credit, right? Because it's not just that you're using a cleaner burning fuel, but they're actually capturing that natural gas off of landfills. You remember back in the day that like burned the
Yeah.
stuff off, God help us. But
Right?
it's captured now and can be used to power our economy. I mean, it's brilliant if you think about it from like an efficiency standpoint, right? And as logistics nerds, we love efficiency. So we're always looking into that. We have a number of electric vehicle pilots right now, and we're always closely tracking all of the different manufacturers that move heavy trucks, who are moving into electric. But I will say, Congress is behind, and it's what's the famous Facebook hearing where the congressman said Congress is good at two things. One is, doing absolutely nothing, and the other is overreacting.
Yeah.
That's where we are. We're in the doing nothing part in Congress right now about clean energy infrastructure for heavy trucking. But I'm hopeful that voices like ours will be this constant, professional, well-informed, data-driven voice for how we can prevent the next supply chain crisis instead of waiting for it to come upon us.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100% there. So, no, I mean, that's all great information, and truly appreciate you sharing. I'm going to change pace here, and we're going to go into some other questions. I know these are some things that are near and dear to you, and some statistics to share in regards to, women starting businesses. Why do we not believe, maybe as a country, that, women have economic credibility? Maybe talking about the women grads. You went to Harvard. I mean, that's very impressive. And so if you want to talk about, that a little bit, and let's talk about, what you feel women are facing out there in starting businesses and all those things that I just mentioned.
Yeah, it's such a mixed bag, right? So first of all, I appreciate it. For a kid from like a one high school town in the Ozarks, yeah, getting to Harvard was not just like improbable. It felt like living literally a Walter Mitty life, and has provided me a lot of perspective and a lot of opportunity that I feel like I need to pay it forward, and I shouldn't screw this up. Like I need to make an impact beyond what will be in my lifetime. And part of how I think we can do that is by building a responsible supply chain, right? By building safe trucking company, like all the things that we've talked about. So I think I've been fortunate. I've worked in two very, very male dominated industries, media, right? Including a piece of venture capital and seed capital investing in media, right? Venture is not known to be a female friendly landscape. And it's funny because my husband's runs a VC backed startup, and I sit on a board of a venture backed startup. So I'm still somewhat connected to that world. But if you look at the data, so not my opinion, not anybody's feelings, but the data, there's less than like 2.5% of venture money goes to all female founder teams, right?
Wow.
And I think it's like 11 to 13%, depending on the year, of founder teams that have a check on it. And there's 11% of the partners in VCs that are female, but it's not 11% of the startups being started by women. In fact, I think, pre-pandemic, so 2019, women were further behind. But since the pandemic, between 49 and 50% nationwide of businesses that are started by women. And, here in places like Georgia, those numbers are actually much higher for women and for women of color specifically. So I find it fascinating that the capital isn't always showing up in women-led businesses in the way that we see them, at least in the venture space. in male dominated startup founder teams. And so, there's a lot of people that are doing great work to change that, but it's not equitable right now. And it's a shame, because if we look at the statistics for the very few Fortune 500 companies that are led by women, I mean, they consistently overperform the index and the market. And that's not a coincidence. So yeah, we've got some work to do. So my personal experience has been really positive in the sense that I've been in two really male dominated industries, but I've never felt marginalized really as a woman. In fact, I feel like we got work to do. And when we came in, we had a very traditional male dominated management team, and they were amazing. They brought a lot of experience. But over the last 15 years, we've gone to where over a third of our management across the company at all levels is women. And if you look at women and people of color, it's like 42%. So that doesn't happen on its own. And it doesn't happen because we're box checking, because I don't believe in that. I think the company has performed better as we better reflect the marketplace in which we operate, and as we make sure opportunities are available to the best qualified candidates. And as we encourage people like women to come into the management track who maybe hadn't thought of it before. So I've had a great experience, but I'm fully aware that, my experience was very privileged, and that we've also gone out of our way to make a way for other women behind us. And I think that gives me a lot of hope. Like, women get stuff done, right? If you want something done, find yourself a busy working mom. And if she will agree to take on your project, because she may be maxed out, right? She gets shit done. Like, I don't know how else to say it. Sorry. I don't know if I'm supposed to cuss, but like in trucking, that's not a problem. So yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity, but I am consistently concerned that we underestimate the economic powerhouse that is American women, right?
Yeah.
In this election this week doesn't do anything to anything to like deter that thought from me. Like, I wonder sometimes how deep this vein runs, that the presumption of women not having that command, is that a political thing? Is it an economic thing? Is it a cultural thing? I don't know. Yeah. But I do know that it doesn't sync up with the reality. And the reality is that like 70 to 80% of all household purchasing decisions are made by women. And half of startups started by women. In places like Georgia, again, it's the vast majority of them. And even in the auto space, right, again, second largest asset beyond a home, 68% of those purchase decisions are made by women. So I kind of feel like if we want to unlock some more potential in our economy, no matter how good or poorly you think it's performing, unlock the potential of women to like get some stuff done.
Yeah, no, I agree with you 100%. I mean, that's part of why we started this Ladies Leadership Coalition podcast. It's why I've done what I do myself by putting myself out there and being a mentor and just really trying to be the advocate for women that, like, you do have a space here. Let's, make sure you're heard, that, you have the opportunities that are out there for you. My company obviously is also woman owned too. And 70% of my staff is women. So we're a little, I would say, lopsided. I mean, it's good, but then, now it's like, okay, we don't have as many men. But I think having that good mix in particular is always good. And I think one of the things, and, again, this is just my opinion, but like, we talk about this a lot on another podcast I'm on, how women, they were typically the homemaker, the one at home with the child. And obviously that's changed, but I think we are seeing more change with more women getting out there. We just need to continue to lift them up and keep getting up there in the ranks. But going back to something you said about the VC money, since you were in that world though, like, why do you think that is? Like, have you been able to ask the question to any of these companies, like, behind the scenes, like what is the problem or why they're not doing it?
I don't know that there's a lot of self-awareness, honestly, in the industry in terms of the why. I do know that there are an awful lot of folks that actually understand it's an issue and are actually actively trying to change that dynamic, right? And that gives me a lot of hope for my daughter's generation. They're 11 and 13, almost 12 and 14. So I feel like we at least now understand the assignment, which is to make sure we're not hobbling this country's economic potential by not appropriately allocating capital to the best possible founders inclusive of women, right? Or to the best possible businesses inclusive of women owned and operated businesses. And but I will say, I think that family dynamic generationally has changed pretty dramatically, and maybe the infrastructure of the capital markets hasn't always kept pace. And honestly, we're probably part of that generation that felt that transition first, I think is the right way to say it. So I'm at the very end of Gen X. I think they call us Zennials because we're like the buffer zone, but the end of the 70s, right? People born at the end of the 70s. So like between the proper Gen Xers and the millennials. And if I think about it, my mom was a stay-at-home mom. She had a fabulous career as a NICU nurse and loved it. But it was 3 kids in their generation. It was almost impossible for her to make enough money to cover childcare costs. And she was still is a phenomenal mother. And this was her joy. And she was very fortunate to have the choice to do that. But when I came up to, I would say postgraduate, sort of 10 or 15 years out of grad school, where I had young kids. And my husband is also a CEO in a startup. So he doesn't have like a huge team full of people, right? Like they're established, but he's not running like Google, right? It was interesting to me. I remember we had a board meeting one day, and my husband's office was actually at the time like around the corner from mine. And I was in the conference room with a board. And I think we had 10 people on our board at the time, most of whom were professional directors, independent. One of them had been on the board of Chrysler. Like these were like serious people. And our newborn at the time, my youngest, had an ear infection or something maybe. And the daycare like immediately came to me. And it was fine, right? Because I'm sure like, sick kid, a lot of times they do want mom. But I thought it was interesting because 15 feet away, my husband was sitting in his office emptying his inbox. And it's not to say that he didn't have stuff to do. He absolutely did. But the presumption was, even though I was a new chairman of the board back then, I mean, I was promoted to chairman in 2014. So I had to have been around then. Ava had to have been maybe like less than a year old, maybe a year. That the presumption was go get mom. Like, even if mom's in a board meeting and dad's checking email, and that's okay. Like, nobody had any bad intentions. It just struck me that like we're in the vanguard of women who are trying to figure out the right model of like, how do we, and we're not the only ones. To be clear, there are women who did this before. My grandmother on my dad's side, my grandmother on my mom's side, being 2 of them, right, that figured it out. I think in their cases, they had to work, right? Like my folks didn't come from much money, and working was a requirement for both of my grandmothers. One of them went back to college in her 60s because she could finally afford to go. And so I'm appreciative that there have been women working since the dawn of time, right? And not to mention all of the unpaid labor we do, caregiving for kids, home, family, aging parents, et cetera. But I do feel like this younger part of Gen X, we were it's like the latchkey kids become parents and working moms, right? Like we're kind of trying to figure out how to balance all of that. And I'm not sure that there was a playbook that we were handed. We're kind of figuring it out as we go. And some days that means I feel like I fail equally in both directions, right?
Yeah.
Every working mom or working parent listening to this, I think will relate to that. And some days you feel like, hot damn, I got it right today. And then you get home and like a baby pukes on your shirt. I mean, it is what it is. And you get up the next day and start over again. But it has been different. And logistics hasn't always been a bastion of female leadership. But I think we're seeing that change, and not changing because people feel like they need to be checking a box of like the right mix of employees demographically. I think they're understanding what Jack Cooper's understood for, since I've been here. The more we look like the markets we serve, the more creative and successful decision making and problem solving we can do, the better service we can provide for our customers.
Yeah, no, that was definitely a great answer. I'm a mom as well of one child. He's 13 now. My husband was a stay-at-home dad initially for a few years, then went back to work, and then I asked him to be stay-at-home again recently, well, about 5 years ago. Now I think he's ready to maybe go back to work again. So interesting enough, my son always went to the father, and he was kind of like, hey, like, you need to go to your mom, because he was so used to dealing with him as I'm like running a business, right? And it is tough, trying to figure that out. But like you said, sometimes you fail, or you feel like you fail, right? But the thing is, like, you're also trying to support your family. You're supporting the people that work for you. You're supporting the economy. Like, just there's so many different layers there that you feel you're responsible for. At least I do. And you can't do it all, but you can do pieces of all of it and still, I think, become very successful in different ways at all of it. So. But I know for me, I do feel like being that role model out there, and I think you're a great role model for women out there that you can do all these things. You can be a mom, you can run for Senate, you can run a company, like all these different things. It's just figuring out what works for you, and if you have that partner or not, and making sure you have the support, which seems like you have a lot of support around you.
We've been really fortunate. My husband is a very good sport here. His hours are crazy in startup land, but my parents live close by, my sisters are close by. We even have colleagues that like will pitch in, like somebody throws a calendar meeting on my invite in the middle of school drop off, and my husband will be on a work trip. Someone on my staff has literally called me before and said, oh my gosh, like, you're supposed to be in carpool line at this time. I'll get the kids. And I'm like, oh my God, I love women. Like, seriously, thank you, because you thought of this. You saw it even before I did, just in the calendar invite. My chief of staff here literally like intervened before it could become a hot mess. And it takes a village, man. I mean, maybe like a few villages, but you've got a 13-year-old, like middle school is a foreign language and an odyssey all rolled up into one, right? Like, it's fun to see their little personalities develop into like a glimpse of who they're going to be as these like awesome adults. And it's also, sort of transformational, I guess, as a parent. That's the euphemism I can come up with right now. It was fun when we were always cool and cute, right? When they were little, and now they're old enough to tell us what they really think.
I know. Well, the interesting thing too is, like, especially when they're little, like trying to feel like you can make them into a certain person, right? Or you want them to be kind and nice and all these different things, right? And so where my son's at today, I feel like, I'm so proud, because I feel like he has become who I wanted him to become, but I also want him to be his own person, right? Like, not trying to force that. But the interesting thing, because of our life and it being so crazy, like, he got to travel with me quite a bit when he was younger and got to see a lot of different areas around the country. But some of the things that people think I'm probably crazy about is, like, he knows how to make some of his own food. He knows how to do laundry, the dishes, like, and obviously my parents were pretty strict with me when I was younger. So I learned at a young age, taking out the trash, doing the lawn, or not just the laundry, but the lawnmowers, cutting grass. And so when I tell people my 13-year-old son does his own laundry, they're like, what? I'm like, like, I want him to be independent and self-sufficient. And if you don't start at that young age, I feel like it's going to be more challenging as they continue to get older. So
it's so true, though, and it serves them so well, right? Like, working parents have been figuring this out since they've been working parents, and I feel like we have to. I overslept. It was probably like I don't know, it was a few weeks ago. And I remember I was so tired. My husband had been on the road for like 3 weeks, and I'm fine for like the first week or two. I really feel like, Billy Badass at the beginning. And then by the time he's like a few days from coming home, I'm just toast. And I had overslept and I panicked. I woke up and I was like, oh my gosh, I got to get all the kids ready. And I go in and my 13-year-old is like, I cleaned the kitchen. I've already made my lunch. I cooked my own breakfast. I put your dishes away and I got my sister out of bed and got her dressed. And I was like, holy cow. I was like, well, I might go back to bed if you could drive yourself. But
See?
it's fun to see them become more independent, right?
Yeah, and the thing is, again, it just kind of shows that like we're running businesses, we're moms, and you can still raise your kids to do these things to help. And oh, I love it. I love hearing that.
It was
That's
fun. It was
awesome.
fun. And, you know, I hope that down the road they actually appreciate. My mom
Yeah.
took up a second career when as we got older. She actually became a writer, which I love. I feel like my alter ego is probably writing novels on a beach somewhere.
Oh,
I hope they sell in that alternate timeline. But my mom's published like 12 or 14 novels, I think, at this point.
oh, that's
And
awesome.
yeah, and you know what? Like, it's really cool that we kinda got the best of both worlds. Like, she was a stay-at-home mom. I didn't have to worry about how I was gonna get myself from place to place. Most time, my dad did as much as he could with his travel, and I never felt like he was absent, even though I think he traveled a lot for work, but I don't remember it that way. They did a really good job of balancing it all. But as she sort of got into the second career, I have to say, like, my mad respect for what my mom could actually do all at once went even higher, right? She could fulfill like the things that fueled her passions, and in her case, quite literally, they're romance novels.
Right.
And she could still like have this family and be kind of the center and the glue for everyone. So it's a balance. If you don't have to do everything right now, you can do everything.
Yeah.
And if you're willing to accept, like, some days you're not gonna feel like you aced the test, and that's
Yeah,
okay. Like, hopefully the next day goes better.
I agree. Well, quick question. Does your dad still have involvement in the business, and what is his involvement?
Yeah, so it's a really interesting dynamic. Having spent the first like decade of my career outside of the industry where my family works, coming home into trucking and transportation and then joining the family business, I became an owner in our business in 2009, like around maybe end of 2009, beginning of 2010, when we bought Jack Cooper, which was our second acquisition. And uh, it I've learned a lot. Like, my dad and I in particular think a lot alike. We're both strategic planning oriented, strategy oriented, long-term planning oriented, however you want to say it. He is definitely more of like the wild-eyed entrepreneur. Somebody wrote an article about him, like, I want to say it was like 10 years ago, and the headline was absolutely brilliant. It was "The Mercurial Mr. Riggs." And I was like, yes, that's it. Um, and he's been a turnaround manager at this point for like 40 plus years, right? So we really do focus our family business on restructuring and turning around Teamster trucking companies. We love the union space. One of my grandmothers, I think the first time she ever got like pay equity was when she was a checkout girl at a grocery store in like, I don't want to say it was like the 50s or 60s, but it was like a union job, right? And all of a sudden she made the same as all the guys. And so we're really proud to be in a union company, but it's a tough place, and it's been a really turbulent time. So it's been great to have my dad's decades of experience and expertise. When we did the leadership transition, which we formally did, this fall, I've been executive chairman for 10 years. So technically it was at the top of the org chart before, but we were always kind of co-piloting. When I became chairman and CEO, he actually agreed to stay as a chief operating officer, which I love because he's really focused on sort of forward looking, high impact, those things where a fast wheeling entrepreneur can really thrive. So artificial intelligence and how that will change routing and optimization, load factor and utilization in logistics. That's where he's leaning in. And at the same time, my sister, who comes from a labor and employment law background and has actually been full-time at Jack Cooper since before I was, she has really stepped up into a chief administrative officer role. So she has finance and accounting, IT, HR, labor, and basically holds the entire shared services organization together.
Yeah.
And it's so much fun to work with her because she's an attorney. Um, I come from the business and finance background, strategy background. So the two of us together have turned out to be really complementary leaders. And also I just love the way her brain works. She is the definition of the busy mom that gets stuff done. She has 4 kids, 2 dogs, no nanny or anything, babysit. I mean, I'm sure they use babysitters. But like, it's a tight ship. And her
Yeah.
husband's a pastor, which, as you know, means you're available like 24/7 effectively for a lot of your congregation. So I like that she is like the ultimate to-do list person, and it makes her a really good fit with some of the back office functions in particular. And I think I bring a little bit more of like the strategy and finance background, but also a lot more of thinking about how do we get ahead of things before they catch up to us. So one of the big transitions for Jack Cooper is that it's been a series of turnarounds, right? That initial 100-person company that my dad bought in 2008 now employs like almost 3,000 people and
Wow.
delivers, as much as 15% of the cars in the US market. So it's become something else entirely. And my sort of data-driven analytics, like think about how this is going to look 6 months and 6 years from now, and what does the data tell us? And then combining that with anecdotally, what do we hear from people on the front line of the operations is just very complementary. And having my dad in the background, still very much in the operations side, but really driving the things that will move leaps and bounds forward on efficiency and service for our customers, I think is the perfect transition. I mean, we'll see. I'm sure you could ask me on a different day and I'd be like, Jesus, like this is hard. We're all running on parallel tracks. But I think we've all kind of hit a rhythm where we know what we're good at and we respect and understand what other people are good at. And we try to leverage all of everyone's strengths rather than, doing a half-assed job on something that somebody else can do better.
Yeah, no, I love that. I love that you've been able to do that with your family, because obviously mine was family as well. And my dad passed away a few years ago. He was in sales. That's what he was strong at. So I actually had to learn a lot on my own. I mean, I've done everything in the company, but I felt like it was challenging to work with my dad. I would say like my work ethic is, just like my dad's, but we did not always think the same. And what I wanted to do was not what he wanted to do. And it was a battle to get it done. Ultimately, we had to buy my sister out of the company. So now it's just me and my brother. My brother does handle some sales with our house accounts that my dad had, 30 years ago, and does a lot of carrier procurement. And I am the one here who's the leader with my leadership team, who's been here a long time, but not family. So it's definitely a totally different dynamic with that. But the people do treat the company as if it's their own, which is awesome, especially since they've been here for a long time. But it would have been great, I think, to have more of a situation like you're explaining, because I think that that's just so cool to be able to do that in a family business, because there's a lot of family businesses that have struggled like mine, where I've had to fight like every moment of the way to get to where we're at today. And I know he was proud, before he passed away, of where we're at, and knew he couldn't get it to this point. But at the end of the day, he definitely obviously brought a lot to the table, on the sales side and those things. But it's very cool that you're able to continue to still work with your family in that way, and everyone knows their role and where they're at, because I think that's so important too, and not to have any kind of jealousy or issues in regards to where you're at. Because I mean, just to be transparent, my sister, who's 3 years younger than me, one of the things that she struggled with was the fact I was in this role and her wanting to either be in this role and working with me. And I wish dad would have made us compete. And at the end of the day, like, I didn't ask for this position. My dad just watched how we all worked, right? And it was kind of like, you do this and you do that. And that's, we did compete in a sense, right? But he was watching to figure out who was going to do that. So yeah, definitely a different little path for me. But Yeah. I mean, I will say though, like it has made me a stronger leader than maybe I would have been if I wasn't put into a situation like that. At least I think that that's the case, you know? So, but yeah, I mean, I'm just very proud of you and the company, like for what you've done with the business. Because to me, it's just incredible and inspiring. So I
Thank
do
you so
appreciate you
much.
sharing. Yeah, no, absolutely. And one of the other things I wanted to ask you too, like, what would you say is one of the achievements that you're most proud of?
Ooh, at work, um,
Yeah,
at work, I would probably put it as twofold. The We consistently provide high quality health care for our employees. And in most cases, it's actually fully funded by the company on the premium side, um, for dependents and for the employee. And in some cases, spouses also choose to join it even if they have their own health care at work. I think healthcare, we don't always, as business leaders, think about that as a business issue versus like a policy issue, right? This kind of sits at that intersection of the two places, um, where I sort of try to talk about how we frame policy issues from a business perspective. And healthcare is more than just a line item in your budget. It's an investment in your team and the workers who make your business possible. It's a statement about the way you value the people who make your business possible. And look, I fully understand. I've worked in small businesses. I think they are the engine of the economy the same way everybody else does. And not everybody can afford to do that for their employees. And honestly, at certain points in time in the last 15 years, I'm not sure we could afford it, right? We went through a bankruptcy restructuring, but we've always really held fast to that as a foundational value, not just for health, but health and safety as a culture. And I think as transportation and logistics executives, you don't have a more sacred obligation than that, right? Our kids, our parents, our friends, our families, our countrymen share the roads with our 80,000 plus pound vehicles. And our obligation, first and foremost, is to operate that as safely as we can. Um, Unfortunately, like any other drivers, accidents happen. Um,
yeah,
but that health and safety focus as a core value for me becomes the touchstone to come back to. And healthcare is a way that we express that. And, whether that's our union healthcare coverage or non union, it's important for me, for people who are working hard, working late, doing their job, that they understand the agreement is we therefore then invest back in you and your well-being. And so that's probably one of the things. And it's tough, right? Because the market to a certain extent punishes companies that try to do the right thing. You don't get any credit. It's actually sort of a mark against you in capital markets for making those investments, if it comes at the expense of P&L growth, right? Um, it- you know, that's a conversation I don't think that as a country and economy we're quite ready to have, but we're going to need to, right?
yeah,
Like this is really the only Western democracy that hasn't had a social safety net for families, um, and independent of where you sit politically, right? Caring for aging parents and family members or chronically ill family members. It's expensive and time consuming. And this country doesn't have a safety net because honestly, for 250 years, women have been the safety net. Like
yeah,
we were the social welfare system in this country. And
right.
whether that's childcare or unpaid labor in the home, it is something that eventually, if we really want to unlock the full economic potential of the nation, we're going to have to face. Like the cost of childcare is prohibitively expensive for many families. And that means kids either end up in an unsafe or suboptimal position, or women or men in some cases, but somebody in the family isn't working. Or, maybe the second safety net that we've had beyond women is grandparents. Lord knows
Yeah,
I've leveraged that one. But I think putting healthcare as an issue that I don't have to worry somebody sitting in our office struggling over is a point of pride at a real deep, visceral level. And so the other thing that I'm really proud of is, I want to be totally clear. We took our company through a bankruptcy restructuring. Now, it was a prearranged one. It was consensual. There were no objections. It was 90 days. Like, it wasn't one of these free fall, we're going out of business. We didn't take away people's jobs in healthcare and pension and all these things. We actually did it to save jobs and make the company more financially secure at the expense of our own pride and our own equity, right? We gave up everything and then had to go and buy the business back again 6-8 months later. But we did that for the right reasons. We did it to make sure the business could continue to serve our customers, could responsibly meet its obligations, and could continue to create the kind of jobs that people can be really proud to have and can provide for their family for. So I would say the second thing I'm really proud of is that we took that really difficult decision. And instead of burying our head in the sand, because remember, back then we didn't know if the pension problem was going to be solved, the bailout was going to happen. In fact, it looked like Butch-Lewis Act was going to be sort of stalled indefinitely in the dustbin of history. We did all of this to make sure we could provide for the people who were counting on us. And it was a really humbling experience. It was a really difficult process. And I think the thing that I'm most proud of is that we did that for the right reasons in the most responsible manner we could to continue to serve our customers, continue the business, and provide for our employees. And in the end, is it an experience I would like to repeat? Absolutely not. But I think I'm really proud of the ethical way we handled it. Nobody objected. Literally none. It was a process that was consensual. It was thoughtful. It was the right things for the right reasons by a group of people who understood why that matters. And that really makes me, even though it was terrifying and painful and difficult and certainly not good for a political campaign, it was a point of pride that we did the right thing. Because think about it, we did that in August to end of October 2019. Yeah. If we had not done that, again, we exited, I think, the end of October, beginning of November 2019. A few months later, the pandemic shut down our customers nationwide.
Yes.
The company would have never survived. And so it's nice to see that sometimes doing the right thing, even when it is the absolute hardest thing, is rewarded by the universe as a thing that protected, thousands of jobs.
Yeah, no, that's amazing. I think both of those are amazing. And going back to the healthcare, like, we used to provide 100%, and we're at 70% right now, and trying to get
That's
the business
incredible.
Yeah, and trying to get the position, where we can continue to get back to that, or years where we've had increases and haven't passed them on. And because I'm obviously concerned about that. And, to your point of childcare, like, we just moved into a new building, and one of my dreams was always to be able to have a daycare. There's a daycare in this building, so that if women have children or men that have children that work for me, and they're able to use it, it's supposed to be at a discount to the tenants that are here, so that they could have their children here and have lunch with their children. And I know a lot of the people that have kids already have them in outside daycares, but in the same token too, like, some are having another child, right, and they're on a waiting list, which is a problem. But the other thing too is, for any of the new people too, like, being able to just support them in those ways that we know that are so hard for them, knowing that, like you said, they're the cornerstone of us, being able to operate and be in business and make us money as a company. So I applaud you for that. I can't even imagine how hard the bankruptcy was, and the fact that it ended the way that it did. I think that's just phenomenal for the company and yourself and your people overall.
Thank you very much. It was an eye-opening experience, right? There are a lot of people, and unfortunately, a number of trucking companies fall into this bucket. lot of times bankruptcy as a process in this country is really abused by companies to shift value to other stakeholders, and often at the expense of workers. And it shouldn't be that way. So I think one of the moments that really I will remember for the rest of my life, it was in our Atlanta terminal at the time. A gentleman I met probably August or July, so right around the time we started our restructuring. He had been with the company for 44 years. And in 4 weeks, he was set to retire. And he was like, he was a very nice gentleman, but he was like a sturdy Teamster dude, right? And he came up with tears in his eyes and just said, "Am I going to get my pension?" And I thought, my God, like, if I have anything to do with it, you absolutely will, because this is why some of us went into business, right? Like, business people do not have to be the villains in every story. We set our own narrative. We can also be the people that lift up the folks who make our businesses possible and provide opportunities for families that create the kind of generational change that a scholarship from General Motors created for my family when my dad got to go to college and be the first person in his family to graduate from college. That to me is, that's why we do this.
Yeah, no, and just to go back on the pension thing, I briefly talked to another woman business owner who she was telling me how her and her husband were going to retire, and they had moved to Arizona to retire. And next thing you know, the company he worked for went out of business and he lost his pension. So now they had to go back to work in their 50s and had to start another business, and literally started because he used to sell things on eBay that he purchased and resold. So they started doing that again, but then started like buying like a toolbox at, Lowe's or Home Depot and then selling the different pieces. And now she's built it to a $50 million revenue business.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. It was just amazing to hear the story, right? But like, again, going back to the pensions, expecting to have that pension to retire, and now you can't retire, and now it's like you got to go back to work and figure it out. And obviously they did, but not everyone's in that position to be able to do that. So again, I applaud you for what you did.
Thank you. I think for business owners and for executives too, right? We have to be really careful I think too often we see like an us and them mentality between our frontline workers and our owners or management teams. And like, let's be clear, you're all on the same boat. So if you're hammering a hole in the side of it, you're all going down together. And I think that we've been very fortunate. And, as far as I'm concerned, our Teamsters and our machinists, we have a few machinists in the shops as well. And our non-union workers are the best damn people in the industry. They are good at what they do. And we've been very fortunate that I think for the most part, it's not an us versus them. It's we're all fighting kind of a common foe, which is a supply chain that's been an absolute pandemonium for years. Honestly, even before the pandemic, but it was certainly exacerbated. This is a survival situation. Think about these companies, especially a lot of your folks that are listening who work in logistics and supply chain. The cost of capital right now is high. And a lot of transportation and logistics businesses on the asset heavy side are very capital intense businesses. And volumes and trailing numbers during the pandemic may have been really, really difficult and challenged. And you're coming out of that time period into a new interest rate and borrowing environment that's very expensive. A lot of fleets have probably deferred some capital investment, whether it was because of lack of access to capital or because of lower volumes in the pandemic. So you may have these CapEx overhangs. And now they're going to be really facing a battle for survival. I think some of the supply chain is really at risk. And we saw this with recent bankruptcy, high profile, I won't say the name, but in the auto industry from a top supplier. And I sort of wonder sometimes if that's going to be the only one, because it's just been a brutal few years. So from my perspective, if you're an us versus them manager when it comes to workers or union members in our company, you're not a fit. This is about all of us realizing we're in a battle to survive all of this change and to provide the service that we've been known for 100 years to our customers. Our 100th anniversary is in 2028. Gives me no small amount of joy and happiness, and I look forward to it. But my job as a CEO is to get us there and to make sure we're set up for the next 100. And that means there's no us and them. There's all we.
Yeah, no, I absolutely love that. And that's a great message. So the last question that I have for you would be, what advice would you give any young woman out there coming into the industry?
Ooh. It is a wild ride, and I hope you love it. But I would say to be open. I mean, geez, if you had asked like Sarah in 1999 working in, getting ready to go do an economics and politics fellowship and work in the small business committee in the House, whether I would be in the trucking industry, I would have literally laughed. I mean, riotously laughed, right? If you would have asked me if I'd spend 10 years in Hollywood doing film and television and media venture, I would have laughed maybe even louder. But some of the most unexpected delights in my career and some of the most rewarding challenges have come from the unexpected opportunities and the ability to sort of grow into and rise to the moment. And so I guess the advice I would give is just be open to all of it. I mean, I remember the day I realized we were going to have to file a bankruptcy restructuring. And I knew it was going to be a restructuring, that we would come out the other side. But I remember like the pride falls first, right? Like it was like, oh my gosh, like again, if it hadn't happened, we wouldn't have been there 6 months later when the pandemic shut our customers down for months. And so if you had asked me, would I spend I think probably about 10 years after I graduated, not even, maybe 5 or 6 years after I graduated business school, I had been working my way up in entertainment. I was not making any money. I had so much credit card debt and student loan debt from business school. I mean, it was not a healthy financial picture. We'll just put it that way. And I'm, still answering phones at a talent agency trying to get promoted. Right. And I had like a little bit of money left in my account. And I think I used all but a couple $100s of it to go to a friend of mine's wedding. Because he just kept calling. A friend of mine from high school married a friend in Joplin, Missouri, married a friend of mine from business school who was from Milan, Italy. I mean, what are the chances I did not introduce them. These two people met of their own accord, which is, talk about a small world. And he kept calling and saying, you got to come. We went to there. And I was like, I have no money. I don't know what to tell you. Like, I can't. And he said, well, I'm going to hold a room for you just in case. And I got a little bit of, courage, I guess, and bought a plane ticket and paid for a hotel for 2 nights. Like that was like all I could afford. So I flew from California down to the Caribbean for this wedding and spent almost all the money I had left in the world. And I thought, this is the most financially irresponsible thing I've ever done in my life. But the first night I was there, this like Italian gentleman who worked with my friend in McKinsey, Milan, came over and said, can I help you find a seat at dinner? And I was like, yes, but just so you know, like, I'm not interested in like men right now. So you can show me a table, but please don't assume this is going anywhere else. I don't even want like friendly conversation. I just want to like go have dinner and go to bed. I'm jet lagged. I wasn't very nice to him. I am now married to this Italian man. And
Awesome.
and the guy whose wedding we met at was the best man in our wedding. And, again, these unexpected twists of fate to me have more often than not provided the biggest personal growth, the most joy, and honestly, the toughest challenges. And I can't say you're always going to enjoy that part. But if you're coming into the logistics industry, you should at least be realistic that you're going to have some of those same twists and turns, and that your willingness to be open to, maybe not a last minute wedding in the Caribbean, although 10 out of 10, I recommend, those are the places that will divide the life you have from maybe the life you want. And I would say go all in.
I love it. Absolutely love it. Well, we're at the end of our show, and this was so great, Sarah, to have you on.
Thank you, Kristy.
I appreciate you sharing your personal and your professional journey. And I just feel like there's so much more we could continue to talk about. So I'll probably have you back.
We'll do it again. There we go. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. So how can people, find you and Jack Cooper?
Okay. So Jack Cooper, we're at the WeBank conferences for women-owned businesses. We're certainly at the Finished Vehicle Logistics Conference, automotive logistics. You can find me. I'm super easy on social media at Sarah Riggs Amico. Is the handle usually. I mean, full warning, if you don't want to see pictures of my youngest riding horses, my oldest playing volleyball, or my particular political persuasions, I'm probably not a great follow. But I love engaging with folks on those platforms. And honestly, I'm a little bit weird in that I don't care if you agree with me or not. I think that's the start of all fun conversations. So, come and find me. Tell me what you're doing in supply chain. Tell me how we can, uplift more women in our industry. I think this is a really exciting time to be, especially for women, but to be in the logistics space.
Yeah, no, I agree. Well, thank you again. We really appreciate
for having me,
it.
Kristy. It was a great conversation. I don't get to hang out in spaces just for women in logistics all that often. So God bless you for this.
I know, right? No, it's awesome. And to all of our viewers, please go out and follow Sarah and Jack Cooper and see what they're up to next, because they're an amazing company and she's an amazing human. And we appreciate having her as a guest. Until next time, thank you.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated it.